People hear the short version of my story and assume they know exactly what it means. They picture the highlight reel, the decision itself, the part that sounds impressive when you say it out loud at a dinner table. And they skip right past the long, ordinary stretch of days that actually led there. I want to tell you the real version, the one that doesn't compress well into a sentence, because I think the compressed version does a disservice to anyone out there quietly living through their own version. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way." If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again. So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up, part of a story like mine. If you'd met me a while back, you would not have guessed that any of what I'm about to describe was coming. I looked from the outside like someone whose life was in order. I had a routine. I had people who checked in on me. By most reasonable measures, nothing was actively wrong. But there's a particular kind of wrong that doesn't show up on any checklist, the kind where every box gets checked and you still wake up most mornings without much reason to. That was where I was living, quietly, for longer than I'd like to admit. Long enough that I'd started to assume it was just what this stage of life was supposed to feel like, that the ache was the baseline now, and not a signal that something needed to change. I want to be upfront that this isn't a story about one dramatic morning where everything suddenly became clear. It was slower than that, and messier, made up of small moments that only look like a turning point when you line them up afterward and squint. A comment from a friend, a sentence from someone I trusted, a conversation I almost didn't have. None of them felt significant in the moment. It was only later, looking back, that I could see how each one had quietly moved something in me that I wasn't fully aware was even capable of moving anymore. If you've watched stories like this before, you probably already know the shape they tend to take. I'm going to try to tell you the parts that usually get skipped. The doubt, the false starts, the people who thought I'd lost my mind, the mornings I genuinely wasn't sure I was doing the right thing even after I'd already committed to it. Because I think the doubt is the part that actually helps someone else. Anyone can tell you about the happy ending. Fewer people are willing to walk you through the uncertain middle, the part where you don't yet know it's going to work out, because that's the part you're probably living in right now if any of this is landing for you at all. So stick with me. I promise the ending is worth it. But I want you to see the whole road, not just the destination, because the whole road is where the actual truth of it lives. I want you to picture something for me. You're standing at your wife's graveside in the rain, and everyone else has already gone back to their cars, and you're the only one left standing there because you genuinely don't know what you're supposed to do next. Not with the day, not with tomorrow. Not with the next 30 years if you're unlucky enough to get them. That's not a low point. That's just a Tuesday, for about a year, if you let it be. I'm Harold. I'm 75 years old, and 14 months ago I sold my house outside Tampa, packed 2 suitcases, and moved to a small town in the Philippines called Tagaytay, on a ridge overlooking a volcano inside a lake. And I did it because staying in Florida was going to be the death of me too. Just slower than my wife's had been. Before I get into how that happened, if stories like this matter to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because there's more of this kind of thing coming, and I think you'll want to be around for it. My wife Patricia and I were married 51 years. We met at a church dance in Tampa in 1972. She was 20, I was 22, and neither of us had any particular plan beyond liking each other enough to keep showing up. I spent most of my working life as a claims adjuster for an insurance company, unglamorous, steady work, and Patricia ran the front office of a pediatric dental practice for almost 30 years, the kind of job where half the neighborhood kids grew up knowing her by name before they knew their own dentists. We had 2 children, a son, Gregory, who lives in Charlotte now, and a daughter, Diane, who lives about 40 minutes from where our house used to be, close enough that Patricia and I saw her and the grandkids most Sundays for over a decade. Patricia died 18 months ago. Complications from a stroke, 3 weeks in the hospital, 3 weeks where I watched machines do the breathing and the deciding that she'd always done herself for 51 years, and then she was gone, and I drove home from that hospital alone for the first time since 1972, and I sat in our driveway for probably 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I want to describe what the following months actually looked like, because I don't think people who haven't lived through it understand how ordinary the collapse actually is. It isn't dramatic. Nobody's falling apart in a way anyone can point to and intervene on. I got up, I made coffee, I watched the news. I ate something eventually, usually standing at the counter, because sitting at our kitchen table alone felt like a small, specific kind of punishment I didn't have the stomach for most days. I fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing, resealed a driveway that was fine, cleaned gutters that were clean, because doing something with my hands was the only version of being alive that still made any sense to me. There's a particular kind of silence that settles into a house after 51 years of a marriage ends, and I don't think I can fully explain it to anyone who hasn't sat inside it. It isn't just the absence of another voice. It's the absence of 1,000 small daily negotiations you never noticed you were having until they stopped, whose turn it was to load the dishwasher, what to watch after dinner, whether it was cold enough for the heat. Every one of those tiny decisions used to belong to 2 people, and suddenly they all belonged entirely to me, and somehow having sole ownership of decisions that small made the house feel less like mine and more like a museum I'd been left in charge of guarding. Diane called most days, genuinely, out of love, not obligation, and she'd ask how I was eating, whether I was getting out, whether I wanted to come for dinner that Sunday. I always said yes to the dinners. I said no to almost everything else. Gregory called on weekends, usually on a drive somewhere, with the radio audible in the background, and our conversations stayed short, comfortable, neither of us particularly good at sitting in silence over the phone, the way Patricia and I had always been able to sit in silence in the same room. About 7 months in, Diane sat me down in my own living room, gently, the way you'd approach someone you were worried might spook, and she said, "Dad, I don't think you should be alone in this house anymore. I think it's time we looked at some options." She meant well. She had brochures for a couple of senior communities near her, nice enough places, activity calendars and dining rooms, and a photo on the cover of 2 smiling strangers playing cards. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I just let the brochures sit on the counter for weeks, untouched, the same way I let most things sit untouched that year, mail piling up in a neat, ignored stack, a stack Patricia would have had sorted within a day of it arriving. I want to be fair to Diane here, because I don't think this is a story about a daughter who failed to understand her father. Diane was right that something needed to change. She was just working from the only 2 options she'd ever really seen laid out for someone in my position: stay put and slowly fade, or move somewhere with staff and a dining room, and call that safety. Nobody had ever handed her a 3rd option to bring to me, so she brought me the 2 she knew. What actually changed everything was a conversation with my own doctor, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who, as it happens, was born in the Philippines herself, moved to the States for medical school in her 20s, and still had families scattered across Luzon that she visited most years. At a routine appointment about 9 months after Patricia died, she asked me straight out how I was doing, not medically, just as a person, and I gave her the honest, flat answer, that I was fine, meaning nothing, meaning I got through the days. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Harold, you don't need a smaller life. You need a bigger reason to get up in the morning." Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that her uncle had retired to Tagaytay years earlier and seemed happier there than anyone she knew back in Florida, and she pulled up a few photos on her phone, right there in the exam room, just to show me, a ridge of a town looking out over a lake with an actual volcano rising out of the middle of it, cool mountain air in a country famous for heat. I didn't do anything about it for another 2 months, but the image stuck, the way certain things stick when the rest of your mind has gone quiet enough to let them. I started reading, carefully, at first just out of idle curiosity, then with a specificity that told me, before I'd admit it to myself, that this had stopped being idle. I read about the special resident retirees visa. I read expat forums late into the night. The same insomnia I'd been fighting for months, finally being put to some kind of use, scrolling through post after post at 2 and 3 in the morning, the way I used to scroll through claims files, back when I still had somewhere to be at 8 the next day. I learned that Tagaytay sits high enough in elevation that the temperature runs noticeably cooler than most of the country, closer to a mild Florida winter than the tropical heat I'd expected, and that the town had become something of a retirement destination specifically because of that climate, along with a genuinely active community of both local retirees and foreign transplants. I told Diane I was taking a trip, 3 weeks, to see a friend of a friend, which was technically true if you counted Dr. Reyes's uncle, whom she'd generously agreed to connect me with ahead of time. Diane was uneasy about it, asked a dozen careful questions, wanted to know exactly where I'd be staying, whether I'd have a phone with international service, whether this friend of a friend had actually agreed to any of this, or whether I was inventing a welcome that didn't exist yet. I told her, honestly, that Bert didn't know me from Adam yet either, but that Dr. Reyes had vouched for me, and that seemed to be enough, in a country where apparently a doctor's word still carried real weight between strangers. She wasn't fully convinced, but I was 74 years old and still entirely capable of booking my own flight, and she knew that, even if she didn't love it. I landed in Manila on a Thursday evening and took a car straight up to Tagaytay the following morning, about 2 hours south of the city, on winding roads that climbed steadily until the air itself changed, cooler, thinner, carrying a faint sulfur note from the volcano below. Dr. Reyes's uncle, a retired engineer named Bert, met me at the small inn where I was staying and spent that first evening walking me along Picnic Grove, a ridgetop park with views straight down into the crater lake, the volcano itself sitting like an island inside an island, one of the stranger and more beautiful things I'd ever seen in 74 years of not seeing very much of the world at all. I stood at that railing for longer than was probably polite to a man I'd just met, just looking, the way you look at something that quietly rearranges your sense of what the world is allowed to contain. Bert had moved to Tagaytay a decade earlier after his own wife passed, and he didn't dance around the parallel, brought it up himself the first night over dinner, told me plainly that the first year alone in the States after his wife died had nearly finished him, and that moving here hadn't erased the grief. Nothing does that, he said, but it had given him somewhere to put himself that wasn't just an empty house waiting for him to notice how empty it was. I sat with that sentence through most of that first dinner, not saying much, just letting it work on me. Bert didn't push. He'd clearly had this exact conversation before, in some form, with other men in some version of my situation, and he had the patience of someone who understood that you can't argue a grieving person into a decision. You can only stand next to them long enough that the decision eventually starts arguing for itself. Over the following 2 weeks, Bert introduced me to more or less everyone he knew, which turned out to be a considerable number of people. There was a weekly gathering of retirees, foreign and local both, at a small restaurant overlooking the lake, and I went twice during that trip and found the same thing I think a lot of people find in rooms like that. A group of people who'd all separately arrived at the same conclusion, that staying put in the life grief had hollowed out, wasn't actually required of them, that there was another option nobody back home had ever presented as a real one. One man at that table, a retired schoolteacher from Michigan named Walt, of all things not the man from a different story entirely, but simply a man who happened to share a name I'd apparently now hear everywhere, told me over a plate of grilled fish that the hardest part wasn't the move itself, it was admitting to yourself that the life you'd been quietly enduring back home had actually stopped being a life some time before you finally noticed. I met a woman named Carmen who ran a small bakery near the town center, and on my second visit she remembered not just my face but my coffee order and handed me a piece of bread called pan de sal, still warm, from the oven without my asking, told me it was on the house for a friend of Bert's, which by that point felt like being handed a kind of unofficial citizenship. I went back to that bakery every single morning for the rest of the trip, and by the fifth visit, Carmen had started asking after specific things, whether I'd slept well, whether the humidity down in Manila had bothered me on the drive up, small questions that added up, cumulatively, to something that felt uncomfortably close to being known by a stranger faster than I'd been known by some neighbors back in Florida after a decade. I met a retired American Navy veteran named Lou, who'd been in Tagaytay 11 years, who told me over beers one night that the thing nobody explains about grief is that it doesn't actually need a familiar house to live in, it travels fine, and what changes when you leave isn't the grief itself, it's everything crowding in around it that used to make the days feel unbearable in specific, familiar ways. Somewhere new, he said, the unbearable parts get diluted by everything you don't yet know how to do, which sounds bad on paper and turns out, somehow, to be exactly the relief you didn't know you needed. Lou had his own story. A wife lost not to illness but to a car accident. Sudden, no warning at all. A grief shaped entirely differently from mine, but landing, he insisted, in more or less the same place eventually. A man standing in an empty kitchen, wondering what exactly he was supposed to be doing with the rest of whatever life he had left. I flew home with a decision more or less made, though I didn't announce it right away. I spent nearly 4 months getting my affairs in order, working with an attorney to make sure everything was properly documented and legal, transferring what needed transferring, keeping what mattered. I set up an international health insurance plan specifically built for retirees living abroad, one that covered emergency evacuation and major procedures, because I knew, with total certainty, that healthcare would be the very first thing Diane and Gregory both pushed back on, and I wanted a real, specific answer ready, rather than a vague reassurance that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of their questions. I sold the house, the one Patricia and I had lived in for 31 years, and I won't pretend that was easy. Going through the closets alone took the better part of 2 weekends, every drawer producing some small, specific reminder, a birthday card, in her handwriting, tucked inside a book she'd apparently meant to give someone and never had the chance to. A recipe clipped from a magazine sometime in the 90s that I recognized instantly by the handwriting notes she'd made in the margin, adjustments she'd apparently decided the original recipe needed and never bothered writing down anywhere except directly onto the clipping itself. I kept that recipe. It's taped inside a kitchen cabinet in my apartment in Tagaytay right now, and I've never once actually made the dish, because I don't think I'm ready to get it wrong without her there to tell me I did. I stood in our empty bedroom the day before the movers finished clearing it out, and I said something out loud to a room that no longer had any furniture in it, something I won't repeat here, just for myself, just to mark the moment properly before I let it go for good. Then I locked the door behind me, handed the keys to the realtor the next morning, and didn't look back at the house again as I pulled out of that driveway for the last time. Telling Diane and Gregory was harder than telling Bert or Dr. Reyes had been, obviously, because they weren't going to just nod along the way strangers who'd already made a similar choice could. Diane cried, not out of anger exactly, more out of a kind of grief-adjacent fear, the fear of losing a second parent in under 2 years, even if this loss was only geographic. She asked me, at one point, voice cracking, whether I understood that if something happened to me over there, she couldn't just drive over the way she could to a facility 20 minutes from her own house. I told her I understood that completely, that I'd thought about almost nothing else for months, and that the honest truth was I'd rather live a real life, 8,000 miles away, with people who genuinely wanted my company, than exist safely 20 minutes from her in a place that felt, to me, like waiting. Gregory was more measured, asked practical questions about healthcare and finances, wanted to see the actual insurance paperwork, wanted a name and number for Bert in case he ever needed to reach someone on the ground quickly, and I answered every one of his questions, because by then I actually had answers, having spent months building this decision on something more solid than just a feeling. By the end of that call, he said something I've held on to since, that he thought Mom would have told me to go, that she was never the type to want anyone sitting still out of obligation to a grief that had already taken enough from both of us. I flew out on a Monday in late spring, one-way ticket, 2 suitcases, and landed in Manila to the same wall of humid heat I remembered from my first trip, followed by the same climb up into cooler air as the car wound its way toward Tagaytay. Bert had already lined up a small rental for me, a modest 2-bedroom unit with a partial view of the lake if you leaned out far enough on the balcony, renting for around 18,000 pesos a month, somewhere in the neighborhood of $320, less than a third of what I'd been paying just in property taxes and insurance on the Florida house. The first weeks were, honestly, harder than I'd braced for, even with all that preparation. I didn't know the town yet, not really, not the way you know a place after you've lived in it. I got lost twice trying to find the public market. I ordered food I couldn't identify at a small carinderia, and ate it anyway, more out of stubbornness than appetite, and discovered it was one of the best things I'd eaten in over a year, a dish called bulalo, a rich beef and bone marrow soup that the town is apparently known for, the kind of thing that warms you from the inside on a cool mountain evening in a way nothing in Florida ever had reason to. I went back to that same carinderia so often over the following weeks that the woman running it, whose name I eventually learned was Edna, started ladling out my bowl the moment she spotted me walking up the road, no order necessary anymore. Carmen at the bakery remembered me the moment I walked back in, greeted me like I'd never left, and within my first month had started introducing me to other regulars, a retired schoolteacher named Nena, who lived 2 streets over, and who, within about 3 weeks, had started leaving small containers of food outside my door on evenings she decided, unilaterally and without consultation, that I probably hadn't eaten properly. I never asked her to. She never asked whether I wanted her to. It just started happening, the way I'm told it happens for a lot of people who move somewhere like this, alone, and let themselves be absorbed rather than insisting on staying separate. I asked her once, half joking, how she always seemed to know exactly which evenings I'd been eating poorly, and she just laughed and said, "Because you are a man alone, and men alone always eat poorly. This is not a mystery." About 5 months in, I had the kind of scare that tests every assumption you made when you decided a move like this was safe. I woke in the middle of the night with a pressure in my chest I didn't like the feel of, and Bert, whose number I'd saved specifically for exactly this kind of moment, was at my door within 15 minutes, driving me himself down toward a hospital in nearby Tanawan that handled anything beyond what the smaller local clinics could manage. It turned out to be severe indigestion, compounded by dehydration, nothing life-threatening, but real enough in the moment that I spent a night under observation regardless, and the entire visit, tests included, came to a little over 10,000 pesos, something close to $180, a bill I stared at for a while afterward, the same way I imagine most Americans do the first time they see what care actually costs somewhere else. Bert stayed in that waiting room the entire night, dozing upright in an uncomfortable plastic chair, waving off every suggestion that he go home and get some sleep himself. Nena showed up the next morning with soup before I'd even been discharged, apparently informed by Carmen, who'd apparently been informed by Bert. A whole quiet network of people looking out for a stranger from Florida they'd known for less than half a year. A network that had assembled itself around me so naturally I hadn't even noticed it forming until it showed up, fully functional, at exactly the moment I needed it. I called Diane from the hospital the next day, because I wasn't going to let her find out secondhand and spend the rest of the week imagining the worst. She was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she asked, carefully, who'd been with me. And when I told her about Bert at 2 in the morning and Nena with soup by 9, I heard something in her voice loosen, the specific sound of a worry finally meeting a fact it couldn't quite argue with. She asked, almost reluctantly, whether the hospital had been adequate, and I described the whole visit in detail, the promptness, the actual bill, and she went quiet again, and then said, "That's honestly faster than I could have gotten you seen back here." I told her, it usually was. The thing that actually changed the shape of my days, though, wasn't the hospital scare. It was something smaller. About 7 months in, Bert mentioned that the local community center ran a modest program teaching basic financial literacy to teenagers from lower-income families in the area. Budgeting, saving, the basic mechanics of how money actually works, and that they were short a volunteer who understood insurance and claims well enough to explain it in plain terms. I'd spent 38 years as a claims adjuster. I showed up the following week mostly out of curiosity and ended up staying for 3 hours, explaining deductibles and premiums to a room of 16-year-olds who asked sharper questions than half the adults I'd dealt with professionally over 4 decades. That became my Wednesday and Saturday rhythm, heading down to that community center, watching a rotating group of teenagers slowly get better at understanding money in a way nobody had ever properly explained to me at their age either. One of them, a serious, quiet 17-year-old named Ramil, started staying after most sessions to ask more, wanting to understand not just budgeting, but the whole underlying logic of how insurance worked, told me once, almost shyly, that he was thinking about studying finance in college if his family could manage it, and asked whether I thought that was a realistic goal for someone like him. I told him it absolutely was, and somewhere in the months since, without either of us quite naming it, I've become something like an informal mentor to that kid, checking in on his grades, helping him think through scholarship applications, doing for a stranger's son what I never quite got the chance to do for my own son at that age, since Gregory and I were always closer as adults than we ever were when he was a teenager, working through his own version of figuring things out. Ramil came by my apartment once, unannounced, a few months into our mentorship, holding a printed acceptance letter for a partial scholarship to a university in Manila. So nervous and so proud, he could barely get the sentence out explaining what it was before shoving it into my hands. I read it twice, just to make sure I'd understood it correctly, and then I did something I hadn't expected to do, which was cry, right there in my own doorway, in front of a 17-year-old who clearly had no idea what to do with an old man suddenly tearing up over his financial aid letter. I told him it wasn't sadness. I told him it was closer to the opposite of sadness, a thing I hadn't had much practice recognizing lately, and he just nodded like that made perfect sense to him, which, somehow, it apparently did. Diane visited about 9 months after I moved, nervous the entire flight over, she told me later, bracing herself for exactly the kind of lonely, diminished version of me she'd feared when she first brought out those brochures back in Florida. What she found instead was a father with an actual calendar, actual appointments, an actual kid named Ramil who showed up at the community center specifically to meet her and talk, unprompted, about how much he'd learned from Sir Harold over the past several months, and who proudly showed her that scholarship acceptance letter as if it were somehow partly hers to be proud of too. She sat with me on my small balcony on her last evening, the lake and the volcano visible in the fading light, and she said, quietly, "I brought you brochures for a place where you'd have people checking on you. You built this instead." I told her that was, more or less, exactly right, and that the difference mattered more than she probably understood before she'd actually come here and seen it. She met Bert and Lou and Carmen and Nena over the course of that week, and on her second to last night, sitting around a table at that same restaurant overlooking the lake, I watched her laugh, genuinely laugh, at one of Lou's old Navy stories, and I thought, watching her from across that table, that this was probably the first time she'd truly relaxed about me since the day I drove home alone from that hospital 18 months earlier. On her last morning, before her flight, she hugged me for a long time at the door and said, "I get it now. I really do." I told her that was all I'd ever wanted her to be able to say honestly, not just as a comfort to me, but because she'd actually seen it and believed it herself. Gregory came about 2 months after that, his own visit shorter but no less thorough in its skepticism, arriving with the same careful, practical questions he'd asked over the phone, wanting to physically see the insurance documentation, wanting to meet Bert in person and ask him, more or less directly, whether he understood the responsibility of being the emergency contact for a man he'd known barely over a year. Bert, to his credit, answered every question with total patience, and by the end of the visit, Gregory had softened considerably, telling me on his way to the airport that he was, in his own words, cautiously impressed, which from Gregory is roughly the equivalent of another man weeping with joy. It's been 14 months now since I landed in Tagaytay, with 2 suitcases and a decision I'd made mostly on the strength of one doctor's offhand comment and a handful of photographs on a phone screen in an exam room. I still think about Patricia constantly, still wake some mornings reaching, out of 51 years of habit, for a person who isn't there, and I don't think that particular ache is ever fully going away, nor do I especially want it to, since missing her, that specifically, is really just another way of having loved her that completely. But I've learned, the way I think Bert already knew and was trying gently to tell me that first week, that grief doesn't require an empty house to survive in. It travels fine. What it needed, in my case, was somewhere to sit alongside an actual life again, instead of occupying the entire thing. I'm 75 years old, and most mornings now I wake up already running through what the day actually holds, whether it's a Wednesday with Ramil and the other kids at the center, or a Saturday with Bert and Lou down at the lake, or just an ordinary morning with Carmen's bread and Nena's inevitable, unrequested container of food showing up at my door sometime before noon. That's not nothing. After the year I had, that's not close to nothing. That's the whole thing, actually, the entire difference between getting through a day and actually wanting to be in it.